welcome to this afternoon session. Our two presenters are going to present for about a half an hour each and leave about another half hour for discussion with you all. Our first speaker will be Teresia Hinga, currently associate professor at Santa Clara University, former DePaul Religious Studies faculty member. We're always quite delighted to have Teresia back with us. Recent publication is Women, Religion, and HIV/AIDS in Africa, responding to ethical and theological challenges. She has long been a part of the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians. Our second speaker is Linh, who's an assistant professor of religious studies at Siena College and a Franciscan. Recently published Rebuilding Religious Experience, and a recent article relevant to our topic, All Look the Same, Asian American Catholics and Racism. So we look forward to have a presentation by both folks. I think we'll go straight from one talk to the next, and so we have time to discuss both papers at the end. So, Teresia, welcome.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm a bit almost kind of derailed here because I'm thinking I'm going to go technological and prepare PowerPoint, prepare YouTube links, and then the technology is simply not responding. So I may have to abandon all this and just speak I was asked by the organizers of this presentation, this conference, to address the whole question of the new Catholicity and the kind of new ecclesiological imaginations that is happening in the context of globalization. And as I was trying to figure out a suitable title for this presentation, I was reminded that I don't visit home very often. I don't go to Kenya very often because of the distance. I'm from Kenya. Those of us maybe might know. I don't go to Kenya very often, but when I do go, I try to tune in to what's going on in the world of Catholicism. And last year I was lucky enough to be able to go home on a research trip. And one of my favorite stopping places is the Catholic bookshop. And I go there and I'm browsing, and can't carry too many books home. One of my favorite stopping places is the magazine rack. And there's this magazine called New People, which caught my attention. I didn't know that I was going to be invited to talk about new Catholicity and new people. And so my title came to me right there. And so I'm going to be talking about the new Catholicity, a new people of God, and a globalized continent. Almost verbatim, taking it from here. New people, the African church open to the world. A ready-made title. Before I go into an attempt to try and share with you what's going on in terms of the realities in Africa and the possible ecclesiological implications of what is going on there, I want to preamble my presentation by pointing out several things. One, I'm coming to you as a lay person. Today I was asked by one of my Father Katonga, I was like, where's your habit? Where are you and I'm like, where did you get that idea? I'm a lay person. I'm speaking about the church from the perspective of a lay woman from the pew. That has probably got some relevance there. I'm also not going to be speaking very as much like Professor Schreiter spoke really from the documents of Vatican II. That I could do that. That has been done a lot. Instead, I prefer to speak from the experiences, to speak to and to speak from the experiences of the people that Father Katongole called the typical Christian, ordinary Christians. What are their experiences today in Africa, and what are the ecclesiological implications of those experiences? And I'm not speaking of these experiences as an outsider. I participate in those, every day I'm here and I'm there. I get woken up maybe 5 a.m. in the morning, they have run out of food or there's no school fees. Those realities are there, but they are also my realities. So I'm a participant and in the realities themselves. I want to recognize the fact that Africa is a very diverse continent. Many people think of Africa as more homogenized and so forth. My students tell me it's a country and the president is Mandela, and I say no, that's not the case. Tremendous diversity. Kenya itself has 40 different ethnic groups. We don't usually understand each other. Different histories, different geographies. Right now, those histories are changing. Like the Egypt of 3 months ago is not the Egypt of today. So I want to recognize that diversity as a reality to reckon with, but also in order to remember not to give generalizations about anything on the continent. The diversity demands that we listen to the possible multiple perspectives, and this allows me to demand that I give a focus. I'm going to be giving examples mainly from the East African region where I grew up, with which I'm most familiar. I'm sure Father Ek was here to tell us more about oil in Nigeria and so forth and the implications of that for ecclesiology. So this recognition of diversity allows me to give specific, or demand that I give specific examples from specific context. It also allows me to offer a gender perspective, an African perspective, an East African perspective. The diversity demands that we listen to the various perspectives of interpretation. The diversity also suggests that it's a very complex situation that we are dealing with. Suggesting complexity that suggests contestation. And so if I'm going to be making any suggestions regarding what could be the shape of the church, we must remember that somebody else could come up right there from Africa, even from the East African region, come stand in front of you and give you a different reading of the situation and give you a different perspective to reckon with. Today we had from Bob Schreiter about the two major perspectives obtained in terms of Catholic discourse. That was very simplified pattern. 2, you mean 100 or possibly more, and that complexity is a given. There's nothing you can do about that. It's born out of the situation. So contestation, even conflict, even contradiction within the perspectives is possible. And so I come to you not so much to prescribe a perspective, but to describe what's going on, but also to offer you kind of lenses through which maybe to begin to think, okay, given these circumstances, this is the possible shape of the church that will emerge from that particular circumstance. And I will be describing some of those circumstances and the kind of ecclesiology that seems to be demanded by those circumstances. I'm also reminded that many times Africa is described as in very ahistorical terms, like all Africa, always Africa, forever Africa, like that. But I would like to suggest that Catholicism, and Catholic thought and practice, is lived in history. It's negotiated within historical context, and so it's important to factor history. I'm just going over my preamble here. We will go to the PowerPoint slides later on. To factor history in order to avoid historical generalizations. And so for the purposes of this presentation, I want to locate 3 landmarks. So somebody else could pick 4 or 5. But I want to pick 3 landmarks in the African context in terms of historical happenstance and try to tease out what are the ecclesiological implications of the 3 are the colonial situation, the 1884. How do we push this forward? Just yeah. I have done all that. So 3 historical landmarks. I don't know whether you can say his time and say land at the same time. But 3 historical landmarks. 1884 and the ecclesiological implications of 1884. 1884 was the year that Africa was cut up like a cake and distributed to the European powers for the purposes of colonization. The Berlin Conference of 1884 and the consequent colonization of the continent and the legacy of that colonization. The second landmark is Vatican II, 1965. That was a major event, and I want to kind of look at the 1844 gave us like negative fallout in terms of ecclesiology. Vatican II suggests some positive fallout that has shaped or could shape our imagination about the church. And the third moment is the fall of Berlin Wall. We go back to Berlin, and this time the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. And if you ask Thomas Friedman, 1989 was one of those momentous moments in terms of globalization. One of the 10 things that flattened the world as far as is concerned is the fall of the Berlin Wall. The walls came down and windows came up, he says. And so Berlin 1989 as a marker of globalization and as a big event in the African world. In factoring history, though, I want to remind us that history does not necessarily, it's not a linear thing. We are not talking about the past being superseded by the present, and the present is an improvement on the past. That's not the way it works. It's meant to work like that in the world of technology. I tried to, when I was coming here, I tried to get myself some phone service. I've lost my old phone. And this phone was lying around, it's never been used. So I thought I just go to T-Mobile and get them to activate this instead of buying a whole new phone. And they said, yeah, we could activate it, but then how are you going to charge it? They no longer manufacture the chargers for this technology. In the world of technology, an old idea becomes obsolete rather quickly. But in terms of human imagination and historical implications of, or applications of those that historical imagination, the past informs the present goes on to the future. Feminists have imagined a metaphor for this as sprang spring. You're bouncing back and bouncing forth as sprang spring and that metaphor. So you're not imagining a linear passage of historical events in the past becoming obsolete. So you find there's a lot of pre-Vatican things going on in the so-called post-Vatican era. We have plenty of pre-colonial mentalities going on in the context of the post-colonial realities. And so we find the phenomenon of neo-colonialism and the legacy of colonialism. So we want to avoid that linear thinking as we try to map out what is going on in the continent. The next major observation I want us to take note of is the fact that, and I use this language deliberately, maybe not without too much, probably not too much support, that the church and society has tended to discount women and children. That's a fact. And the language of discounting is coming to me from the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. Remember, one of the miracle stories. Jesus fed the 5,000 with 5 5 loaves, 2 fish. And then the miracle of it was allegedly that, 5,000 people were fed, not counting women and children. And that is, it's a mindset that tends to be, they didn't count, people were fed, but we are not even counting women and children. And I'm not saying that that was necessarily incorrect or whatever. It's probably spoke to the mindset of the time, that who gets to be counted in or out. And I'm suggesting that society has tended to continue, church and society, to discount women. There's major implications of that discounting of men and women. So you have to factor that. And for my purposes, then I have tried to count men, women, count everybody, women, men, and children, and also to begin a mindset of also counting on women, as we're talking about the agency of women themselves. And so those are some of the general observations that I would like to make as I said before. So what I want to do now is to take us back down memory lane for a minute. And I know my PowerPoint can tell I don't do these PowerPoint things too often. Take you back down memory lane. And maybe start with the Vatican II event, and then probably go back to colonialism and so forth. Vatican II happened in 1965. 1965 was an era of great expectations in Africa. Simultaneously, Vatican II was happening, but many of the colonists were gaining at least what came to be known as their flag independence. So there was a lot of hope, both because of Vatican II and both because of places like Kenya just got Uhuru, 1963. So from the positive fallout of Vatican II, I want to highlight 2 things that happened as a result of Vatican II. One is the beginning, the embryonic beginning of a church that is genuinely African. The Vatican II allowed the vernacularization of the church. For the first time, we could pray Our Father in Kikuyu. Like, that's what we've been saying all along. Paternoster quiescence, my mother still prays in Latin, but we cannot say it in Kikuyu, and it's much more different. So it's not just the liturgy, but the drum. We could now play the drum and dance, and to inculturation and the birth of an African church. We were still en route to make it that much more of an African church in that way, as compared to the pre-Vatican II church, which was very much a European affair, and deliberately so, because they tried to make Africans as European as possible. Those are big improvements. The second improvement born out of the Vatican II possibilities, I don't have it on the slide, is the emergence of the Church of the People. Hitherto, it was a very clerical church. People went to church and listened to Mass, and occasionally went, not so long as you went to Mass, listened to Mass on the holidays of obligation, you are good. You are good to go. But post-Vatican II, particularly in Africa, the churches came together and began to try and bring in the laity into the picture much more. And to cut a long story short, the movement of the small Christian communities, the very in the villages, energized by the bishops and so forth. But in some cases, these communities springing up spontaneously. And finally, instead of just going to church, people are beginning to be church. I want to say the language with which my community describes that reality of the village community that is church is Mwaki. Mwaki, we don't speak, it's too long to say small Christian community, we just say Mwaki. Mwaki it means 5. in my language. It's a metaphor that was drawn from the traditional understandings of community and the way community is organized. And Mwaki refers to the unit of households which can share fire. There were no matchboxes those days. You needed to go to the person who preserved their fire last night and fetch a few embers so that you can come and light your fire. And the fire fetching distance, the distance within which you can share fire. So it's a metaphor that suggests sharing communion, it suggests communication. It also suggests for a fire to flicker up and to give warmth, you need to put those pieces of wood together, and so when people gather for these small Christian community gatherings, it's like very much like you put those logs together and the fire will raise out. So the birth of the African Church of the People and the small Christian communities. The two things from Vatican II. The negative fallout from colonialism and neocolonialism. The colonial project coincided with the missionary project. That's the unfortunate fact of history. 1884, 19th century, the missionary project to Christianize Africa, they coincided. The unfortunate thing is that there was kind of a buddy-buddy, the missionary project did not quite distance itself from the imperial project. And that created a big ambiguity in terms of ecclesiological thought and practice in Africa. We are still experiencing the problematic of colonial practices in terms of distributive justice, in terms of conflicts that are still raging because of the arbitrary boundaries that were created by the colonial governments. We have escalating armed conflict in places like Congo and so forth. And the question then, in terms of this legacy of colonialism, where is the church? We also have the phenomenon of neocolonialism. 1963, Kenya got independence, but Kenya is not uhuru, is not free yet. Colonialism went out of the front door. It came back through the back door in the form of multinational corporations, economic dependence, government manipulation, and so forth. So the question there is, this legacy of colonialism and neocolonialism, how can we begin to develop an ecclesiology that partners or accompanies the people on the journey to their true uhuru, to their true liberation? A new Catholicity and we moved on. A new Catholicity and globalization and the ecclesiological implications of 1989. And here, kind of just summarize the situation. The end of the Cold War, we know of it as the end of the Cold War. The fall of Berlin Wall brought the end of the so-called Cold War. And the de facto seeming victory of capitalism and the globalization of capitalism. And we probably should be talking to Michael Moore a little bit more in terms of the real painful ramifications of that globalization of capitalism. It has tended to result in extreme wealth on the part of a chosen few or self-selected few, if you ask Madoff. He's just riding on everybody's ignorance or and getting $50 billion at the expense of the billions at the bottom of the pyramid. And this whole idea of the pyramid is important. So I would like to suggest that globalization has brought onto Africa a situation which I call a situation of chaos. I don't know, Professor Schreiter, have you been to Africa? Have you been to Kenya? Have you been to Korokocho? Not yet. So there's a natural place called Korokocho. It describes, this is one of the biggest slums in Nairobi, in Kenya. We have the reputation of having the best. If you want to see the best slums, or the biggest slums, the tourist attractions, Kibera of the constant gardener fame, and this korokocho. Korokocho means, in my language, it means a dumping place. That's where you throw what you don't want, and it's also a place of chaos. It's very much reminds me of Gehenna in the biblical language. And situations of chaos in economic terms, extreme poverty that has left people's lives upside down. And I was going to show you actual footage of a woman's life and her child in Korokocho. I was not able to do so, but we can see some of the strengths. Poverty and hunger, extreme. I was born and raised in Kenya. I came here in the 1990s. It's getting worse as we go. I have not seen that kind of poverty when I grew up. It was possible to not just fetch fire from the neighbor, but also if you're hungry, your neighbor is obliged to give you food. I remember visiting my sister in the 1970s with my baby, and somebody provided me with milk every day until I left. That's not going to happen now. There's certainly to share their world upside down, and we know these pictures. Children are the worst hit. This is hunger. This is not missing one lunch or missing breakfast or even going on Lent. This is a body so hungry that it's eating itself. And there's plenty of that. You'll see those pictures around. A world upside down, rendered upside down because of conflict. The world of hunger is the world of what I call co-violence. That child is suffering from violence. Violence is not just the kaboom kind of violence. But this is hot violence, born out of the desperation. Sometimes people get at each other's throat because the resources are so few. These are actual footage from Kenya. The government trying to evict squatters who are squatting in the forest, trying to grow some corn between the protected trees, and the government deciding you are the problem, get out, and they come and touch their new homes. And this was the violence in 2007 because those in power did not want to acknowledge that they have missed being elected. We are still reaping the legacy of those kinds of violence. Chaos, korokocho in climate, in the world of weather. You don't know when to plant or when not to plant. What did the weatherman say? Droughts followed by floods in quick succession. And this was 2007, the year of the election violence. The same year was a year of drought. And I remember talking to this young girl. She had walked 40 kilometers to look for water and food, not just for herself, but for her goats. Reminded me of the good shepherd idea right there. They buried animals in mass graves. They just were dropping dead. By the time the government brought them to slaughter them, they were dead. Those images are really harrowing. Consequences of this chaos, this cause and consequence, displacement of peoples, and the emergence in places like Kenya and elsewhere of these almost permanent refugee camps. Since 2007, we have thousands of people still living in tents like so. I want to go back, so that's the fallout, the negative fallout of colonialism, and globalization, and the emergence of a chaotic realities in which people live. But I also wanted to remind us that they have missed to say that women are not just victims of their circumstances. They are not being saved like those animals. They are humans and they have agency. And so I'm delighted to report that as much as women are victimized by these multiple chaotic circumstances in which they live, they have fought back and they have struggled. And I was very impressed, as much as I was disturbed by the horrors of animals by the roadside and violence. I was very impressed by these women. I was researching poverty and I chanced upon this billboard right on the roadside and thought, oh, there must be an NGO right here doing what the NGOs do best to save Africa. And I stopped, and this woman was at the bus stop there. She said, "Oh, you are looking for that place? That's my home. Let's go." And I found that it was a Monday. Mondays are I learned then that the Women's Day for meeting in groups to try and think through and solve their problems. And this group of women, they are 60 and up, most of them, have decided to tackle the question of food security from the grassroots by planting trees. So these circumstances of chaos, circumstances of people of God who are on the run, on the move, on the run, disoriented. What kind of ecclesiology does this demand of us? And I want to suggest that out of this chaos, out of this sense of, there is no manual anymore. Karl Rahner is the kind of person who say, let's not go to manuals. There are no manuals to help us deal with the effects of the tsunami. For example, if you are a pastor, you have to create it as you go. And as I was preparing for this presentation, some of the possible ideas about possible ecclesiology came through to me. Some of them, one of them comes from the world of Desmond Tutu in South Africa. Because of globalization, because of the prior diversity of the continent, we are already a very diverse people. But globalization has also meant a rapid movement of people, right, left, and center, and encounter of different peoples in places that you would probably never imagine to meet. Today I opened my email and there was an invitation to go out to dinner. This is a good one. With people from Turkey who happen to be in Silicon Valley, and they're trying to respond to the diversity. How can we maximize the relationships that are pushed upon us by globalization? Desmond Tutu raised the whole idea of possibility of a rainbow people of God, thinking of South Africa post-apartheid, and imagining a nation that thrives on pluralism. And I'm thinking, when you're considering the plurality of possibilities escalated by globalization, it was always there, can we begin to create an ecclesiology that handles difference better, that focuses on pluralism rather than just disrespecting or thinking negative thoughts about somebody just because they are different. The idea of the dignity of difference and the quest for an ecclesiology of pluralism. Earlier on, I spoke to you about Mwaki, the idea of fire. Before, immediately after Vatican II, it was easy in the 70s, just translate this concept. The same people that we used to share fire with can be in our basic Christian community, no big deal. But how does that translate in Silicon Valley? I know that the priest there has been trying to create a small Christian community for us, and it's not small at all. It's really, his parish goes all the way from San Sacramento to San Jose, and our small Christian community, Mwaki, is the whole of San Jose area and then Sacramento. How do you do community rekindle the vision of that notion of church and the people? How do you begin to awaken not only local possibilities of sharing, but sharing across borders? I'm thinking of those horrors of environmental degradation, if I can take 2 minutes or so, and the need, the imperative for a green church in Africa and beyond. And as I said, African women are not just victims. We have, this morning we got the story of a bishop who is doing his best to deal with the whole question of peace and peace building in Uganda. And present Wangari Maathai, who happens to be Catholic. I will present her anyway, even if she was a Muslim, for the work she's doing to try and create ecological consciousness in us. As it turns out, she happens to be a Catholic, but she's also asking us to go back to the indigenous sensibilities and begin to lift back into a consciousness that which we lost under colonization, when we were told we must cease to be African in order to be Christian. What did we lose in terms of even our connectedness with each other and connection with the world around us, and the consequences of the fallout of that disconnection? Let me, I know kind of had to go through this rather quickly, but I want to suggest that in terms of ecclesiological imagination, that women have not been accepted that status of being discounted, just like you're not counting us, then therefore we are not going to do anything about it. I'm suggesting that some of these ecclesiological thoughts, new thoughts and imaginations, are well captured in the work of the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians. As an example of women doing theology, we could also talk about humanist thought or the work of people like Rosemary Luther. But here I'm listing the work of the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians and suggesting that in their work, in their thought and their thinking, there's a symbolism there that we could think of, but also the practice behind, the thinking behind some of their practices. And I'm reminded of Letty Russell's thought as she imagines the church of the future as a church in the round, the shape of the church in the future, the church in the round, and structurally, the circle allows face-to-face conversation. If you begin to talk now, we are arranged such that you can only speak to each other's back. But the circle demands that. The circle also is ever expanding. You can't say there's no room in the circle. It will accommodate as many people as there are, as compared to pyramidal thinking that ends up at a point at the top. And some of the problems, as we have pointed out, have to do with this pyramidal thinking, hierarchical thinking. The colonialists colonizing, the racists doing their racist thing, the gender hierarchy, and so forth. And my time is rather out, but I have teased out. This whole idea of circle thinking and circle practice, both as symbol and practice, in an article that I have published in this book. It's called Prophetic Witness, Catholic Women's Strategies for Reform. And here I just had time to just like bullet point some of what is going on in my analysis. I'm a participant, a founder member of the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians. And some of the things we do is to insist that we cannot just be like ostriches in the sand. We have to name what the issues are, and there is power in that naming. It shouldn't be always somebody else naming on your behalf. A diagnosis, you go to the doctor, you name your own pain, you have a better chance of being cured than somebody naming it for you, or worse, not naming it at all. We have researched and published on the whole question of transformative dialogue, not just dialogue for the sake of dialogue, but talking about issues so that we can transform this chaos into something much more readable. So dialogue is prologue to solidarity. You cannot be in solidarity with somebody who don't even know what the problem is. We also try to lead the dialogue, and I could give you examples of how that has happened in real time. The circle consists of Catholics, Christians, Muslims, indigenous practitioners. And we didn't start from the point of we know each other, we love each other. It's a forum for us to understand each other. And one of the examples I could give is during one conference, we decided to be inclusive, and we decided that each day a different religious tradition was going to lead us in prayer. So one day was dedicated to the Muslim women to lead us in prayer at 8 a.m. What's wrong with that picture? 8 a.m. Muslim women lead us in prayer, please. 8 a.m.
Are they supposed to do their traditional prayer?
They're supposed to, they pray 5 times a day, but they don't pray by this clock. They pray as the muezzin calls. So there used to be a slot to educate us about Muslim women prayer. Circle thinking, transforming power from pyramid to much more inclusive, and the whole question of global justice and ecclesiology of mutual accompaniment. This is crystallizing very well in South Africa. They talk about the Oikos journey. After apartheid, after they dismantled apartheid through the Black Liberation theology and the Kairos document of 1985, now they are talking of accompanying the impoverished on what they are calling the Oikos journey, or the economic journey out of that chaos. And the circle is big, as feminist practitioners are, on the whole question of conscientization, consciousness raising. And as I talk about the imagination of women as moral agents, as theologians, as thinking Catholics, as we were told yesterday, I'm reminded of the role at least we have played among ourselves to energize that critical thinking around issues and to awaken our awareness, at least within the circle, but also that role outside the circle. I was going to show you some nice footage, well, not so nice footage when it talks about the Korokocho. I have 2 video clips that I was supposed to show. One, the life of a woman caught in Korokocho, the literal Korokocho. Next time you and I go, we'll go to visit with this woman. A whole category of domestic workers, women who go to people's homes to wash clothes for them as a way of making that $1 that you hear about. It's made, it doesn't come down, it's made through hard work. And this is the story of one woman who has 3 children, one of whom is 5 months. She's still breastfeeding, but every morning she has to see the 2 grown, to school without food in their belly. Then she goes to drop the baby in daycare. You would have seen what the daycare involves. She leaves the baby with a bottle of black tea. She carries the milk with her. She can't breastfeed. Then she goes 45 minutes walk away, one way, to go and wash clothes. That was her story. The story of other washer women is even more harrowing. But she was talking about how she's breastfeeding, she's hungry, she has no money, but yet she has to make a living for herself and for the babies. The final clip was going to be a more positive one. And it was inspired by the fact that we have, since I started thinking about this paper, the tsunami has happened, and floods have happened in Australia, and an earthquake has happened in New Zealand, and another earthquake. And there's a sense in which these physical disasters are also happening, probably metaphorically, in people's lives. There's probably a tsunami effect when you wake up and find you cannot feed your children. So what to do? And I was going to suggest through that video. It was a video of a dancing church in Africa refusing to let despair have the last one, because hope is a necessary ingredient in the African church, if not in the global church. I was also going to talk about the need to address the whole question of global connection for communities of faith that are scattered all over. They are dispersed, the whole idea of diaspora, and the need to gather them and at the same time recognize that they are in both places. A phenomenon I call it the global church. It's a way in which we are in California, or we are in Chicago, AK and I, but there's a way we are in Nigeria or in Kenya simultaneously. And that has happened because of globalization. How can the church be reimagined to address that global parish? I'll leave it there, and we probably will speak a little bit more of in question time. The examples I had for these whole people who have survived the tsunamis of life. The example of the Green Church, I thought of Wangari Maathai. For the example of people who have survived and insisted on hope, resilience, her name is Immaculée Yabis. Anybody heard of her? Yes, a survivor of the Holocaust, of genocide in Rwanda, and she's taken to jail to see the person who totally destroyed her family, and the expectation was that she's going to tear his eyes out and so forth, and Immaculée says, I forgive him. And then the question of tsunamis and earthquakes. So John Sobrino has written a good kind of analysis of what are the theological implications of these so-called natural disasters. And my apologies. I'll leave it there and then we can talk.
Thank you. So, Linh.
Okay.
Good afternoon. Similar to Teresia, I haven't been back to Asia that often, twice. Once back to my homeland after my refugee experience in 1975. My work has been mainly on Asian American studies, and what I'm going to try to do today is give a theory of what I've been doing with Asian American studies to the idea of space. So my paper is called Mapping Spaces, Catholicity and Religious Pluralism in Asia. The website Union of Catholic Asian News promotes currently a survey that asks the question, has enculturation lost its meaning in the globalized world? The responses from 55 people were 34 people, no, which is 61%, and yes, 22 people, which is 39%. This caught my attention not only because of its relevance to our conference on discourse on Catholicity, but also how it raises awareness to the effects of globalization on enculturation. If globalization is viewed simply as the formalization of neoliberal ideology, which is a more negative view, then it means that it is the triumphant rhetoric of the centralized free market, privatization, deregulation, and a return to an administered technocratic Taylorism. From the perspective of globalization, one measured mainly as a tool of the marketplace to convert everything into a commodity for consumption. It challenges religion generally and enculturation particularly to correct this leveling by commodification of all aspects of human existence. In order then to do theology or study religion in general, one must acknowledge the influences both negative and positive of globalization. It has shaped the understanding of religious practices not only in countries where these religions originated, but also in the new countries where these religions migrated. Religion encountered changed worlds, cultures, and identities. The location of a religion has been altered. And following a quote from the religion theorist Manuel Vázquez, who captures this trend, and I quote, as groups migrate, regroup in new location, reconstruct their histories, and reconfiguring their ethnic project, the ethno of ethnography takes on a slippery, non-localized quality. The landscapes of group identity around the world are no longer familiar anthropological objects, insofar as groups are no longer tightly territorialized or spatially bounded. Even as these lands are no longer tightly bounded, they witness to the creation and the transformation of religions. This approach to space, or more precisely the production of space, that frames my discussion of Catholicity and religious pluralism in Asia. The form of a space discloses a set of power relations, a system of rules, do's and don'ts, through which social behavior is mediated. To avoid the artificial dichotomy between a spatial form on one hand and social behavior space on the other hand, the two must be conceived dialectically as part of the same process, which French sociologist Henri Lefebvre calls the production of space. Lefebvre wants to uncover the social relationship that is embedded in the space itself, and not particularly to find a religious aspect in the production of space. I contend, however, that production of space reveals naturally a relationship with the divine or the supernatural. Space also provides a history, especially one that one's familial identity and social upbringing. In the case of Catholic mission to Asia, Catholic identity etched in the landscapes and memories of the converted population remains. And I quote from Lefebvre, "Nothing disappears completely, however, nor can what subsists be defined solely in terms of traces, memories, or relics. In space, what came earlier continues to underpin what follows," unquote. That the missionary space produced in Asia thrived in some places and disappeared in other places may be attributed to the strategy of the missionaries or the reaction of the people they encountered. Why and how did space become an important focus in religion? Manuel Vasquez asserts that Emile Durkheim was one of the early proponents of space as central to study religion. Religion is defined as by the tension between the sacred and profane as produced by social structures and division. The sacred is added to it. And that's what quotes Durkheim. The sacred character assumes an object is not implied in the intrinsic properties of this latter. It is added to them. The world of religious things is not one particular aspect of empirical nature. It is superimposed upon them. Unquote. Furthermore, the relationship between the sacred and profane is a universal and also characterized by heterogeneity, which Durkheim describes as the classification of things and also as absolute. Thus, the sacred and profane is the ultimate example of two categories of things so profoundly different and opposed to each other. And furthermore, according to Vasquez, space holds in tension two opposites, and at this point, enter into the theory of religion from Durkheim. The distinction between the sacred and profane, taken up later by Eliade, differs slightly from Durkheim, where Eliade rejects Durkheim's sociological reductionism, which makes the sacred purely relational and a contingent category invested by the power by the social group. Eliade, quote, "The sacred itself has an ontogenetic power, the power to give rise to reality, to space and time, and thus to make possible the emergence of the social, which Durkheim falsely considers as the independent variable." Even though both sociologists privilege either the sacred or profane, their debate demonstrates that the sacred and profane constitutes a system that can only be thoroughly experienced and understood within a social space. This system supports the production of space as proposed in this presentation. This brief outline on production of space, I believe, sets the tone for discussion of Catholicity. In order to trace the development of Catholicity, Ignatius of Antioch needs mention. He was the first to speak about the Catholicity of the Church in connection with Eucharistic gathering and the construction of a local church. And I quote, "Wherever Christ is, there is the Catholic Church," which he wrote to the letter to Smyrnians in around 100 CE. He uses the adjective Catholic and not the noun Catholicity. This is more important because Catholicity is not an abstract concept or an ideological formula, but the mode of life of a certain community, that is, the Church, the body of Christ. Thus, Catholic applied to the Church is a totality or integrity. The Church accepts and experiences the whole truth incarnate Jesus Christ. The Church is not tangible as the assembly of the faithful. The Church becomes a system of flow between the sacred and the profane within the newly produced space. The early Christians, then subsequent generation of Christian believers, who spread the message of Jesus Christ by gathering as church. And these gatherings exemplify the production of spaces where the gospel would be shared anew. Specifically, later in church history, when European Catholic missionaries established new physical spaces in Asia, where there had been already centuries of religious encounters with Hindu temples, Buddhist stupas, and Taoist shrines. These physical reminders witness to an enduring religious memory that the missionaries either appropriated or dismissed. The negotiated identity where the production of space is recasting European Christianity in a different way with Asian perspectives and landscapes. From the production of space, missionary history informs contemporary society in order to create a new Catholic space. This new space, then, carries uneasiness and even a discomfort as those within it attempt to negotiate powerful cultural claims of legitimacy. These new tension challenges a new loyalty and citizenship. It becomes profound risk-taking for anyone who wishes to claim identity in the new space, that is, to claim being Christian. So in this presentation, I will first briefly describe the history of Catholic mission to Asia, stressing the plural religious identities of Asia. Asia is the home of all five of the world's major religions: Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. In this section also will highlight some of the well-known missionaries such as Roberto de Nobili, Matteo Ricci, and Alexander de Groot, and their major strategies of mission to the Asian people. One need to keep in mind that there are strategies for productions of a new Catholic space that in some places remain a strong presence in various parts of Asia. Finally, I will highlight the practice of dialogue that was stressed by the Federation of Asian Bishops Conference, FABC. Dialogue practice as part of production of faith occurs through continual interaction with other cultures, the poor, and other religious traditions in Asia. This triple dialogue finds itself thrust into a new space constructed out of the European missionaries, maintained by converts in light of the religious tradition, and continues to develop within a globalized world. European mission to Asia. Matteo Ricci, an Italian Jesuit, brought many scientific work to China, and one was a set of maps, which at first created great interest among the Chinese. After thorough examination, the Chinese realized how the foreigners perceived the insignificance of its kingdom, since it was thrust into a corner instead of being in the center of the world. They became disgusted with the missionary for this insult and their perceived significance. Ricci, seeing their dissatisfaction, set about constructing a map of the hemisphere on a great scale, so adjusted that China, with its subject states, filled the central area, and without deviating from the truth of projection, occupied a large space in proportion to the other kingdoms gathered around it. All the names would then enter in Chinese calligraphy. This map obtained immense favor and was immediately engraved with expensive viceroy and widely circulated. The production of a map underscores the production of space as a negotiation of identity and imagination. Here, imagined to be the center of the world. This projection refashions the lands not only as a position of how our country saw its importance. The production of map worked out by both sides. European missionaries and upper classes in China stress a limitation of discussion of Asia even today. So it is impossible for any one person to thoroughly discuss Asia because it encompasses an expansive and diverse geographical area that contains about 60% of the world's total population. It is even more complicated to discuss Catholicism in Asia. Christianity is by far the smallest religion in the originating continent. Only 1.5% of the total population is Christian, and less than 3% of Asia's population is Catholic. The study of Christianity in Asia tends to rely on the large empires in Asia of China, India, and Japan. However, these countries only represent a fraction of the Catholics in Asia. Catholicism has been greater in the less dominant parts of the continent that represent a small fraction of the overall population. The Philippines and East Timor are predominantly Catholic. East Timor has 96% Catholic population, and the Philippines 82% of the population. In fact, about 63% of all Catholics in Asia are in the Philippines and East Timor. Catholicity in Asia naturally considers the influence of mission activities. In general, missionaries in Asia encountered many challenges in their effort to evangelize the indigenous people. And there are lists: established religious traditions, expansive territories, multiplicity of languages, diversity of cultures, resistance of local political and religious leaders, the limited means of communication, scandalous behaviors of colonizers, and the rivalries among the religious orders themselves. So the missionaries did not offer a theory of culture or describe cultural formation or even how the word enculturation, but they knew the differences between the Asian cultures they encountered and the need to make the Christian belief understandable. In these encounters, I would like to stress three aspects of space production here. First, literary space, that is through Latin and the European languages. Bodily space, of wearing rosaries and crosses on their body, and then physical space, constructing church buildings. All three spatial productions challenged both missionaries and local people about their perception of religious and cultural markers that for the most part did not neatly translate. These three examples of spatial production will be further expanded through the examples of the Nobili and the Road. The Nobili is best known for his work in the southern region of India, which is dominantly Tamil-speaking. He arrived in 1605 and moved to Madura, where he settled. What the missionaries encountered in this town was more than 10 or 12 different Hindu sects, along with the Muslims and the indigenous Christians. Each sect dressed differently, even the gurus and sannyasins were distinguished from one another. The type of dress distinguished to what caste and sect one belonged. These differences intrigued the Nobili and also influenced the way he adapted the culture, creating controversy among his fellow Jesuits. And I'll take a quote from Ina Zapata in her book, Disputed Mission. Robert the Nobili, going native and renouncing relationship with low-caste people, was resented by the Jesuits. So the controversy of wearing native clothing was settled by Pope Gregory XV in 1623, when he did allow the Nobili to wear the dress of a Samson and also to keep his head shaven, as long as he did this not to provoke any superstitious rituals. The issue of not relating with the lower class was not remedied or really even discussed. While the Nobili was the exception, in general, the missionaries understood their role and place because no matter how much they wanted to be native, they were limited. Each accepted a Tamil definition of their respective position in the local social hierarchy and the structure, and continued the play in which they had been cast. While the Nobili was interested in interpreting text and representing significant human action, such as miracles and conversion, which he himself was the main actor or author, his fellow Jesuits described the world they saw in a much more humble manner. The tension between the missionaries did not deter the Nobili. His concern for acceptance among the upper classes did not limit his ability to describe some of the culture markers for the rest of the society. But however, Zapanov goes on to quote, the problem of the true Indian customs was left unsolved, but the explanatory concept overarching it remained for centuries to come locked in the dichotomy of religious and civil, nourishing further scientific disciplines such as Indiology and anthropology. So there's never real clarity among the Nobili's writing about Indian customs. About the time that the Nobili was settling his dispute in India, Alexander the Rhodes entered Cochin China, which is now the southern part of Vietnam. The Rhodes was a successful missionary in his relatively brief time in Vietnam. He was able to create a cohort of indigenous catechist, a translation of catechism, and the Vietnamese Latinized writing system that is still used today. And I quote from Peter Font, whereas the missionaries in China and Macau were distrustful of the natives and were reluctant to have them ordained, the Rhodes went out of his way to promote the local laity, allowing them to be ordinary ministers of baptism and encouraging them to lead the assemblies in prayer and devotion. So Catholics moved from carrying Catholicism on their body to harden it in space when new colonial locations were established. For example, Vietnamese Christians tended to wear images, crosses, and rosaries around their necks as a witness to their faith. These signs made the newly formed Catholic easy target of persecution for those weary of the Christian faith already. The emperors would sanction such persecution, motivating the missionaries to explain to the new converts the importance of wearing or not wearing religious symbols on their bodies. And Peter Font goes on to state, by wearing the sacred object ostentatiously, Vietnamese Christians set themselves apart from the general population, and this is what is required by the Christian faith. Even though it's not a requirement, Christian faith inevitably urges its believers to mark themselves apart from others, thereby creating a sacred space. As Benedict Anderson notes, the status of Latin as the lingua franca expressed the power of the Church, and I quote from Anderson, The astonishing power of the papacy in its noonday is only comprehensible in terms of a trans-European Latin writing clerisy and a conception of the world shared by virtually everyone, that the bilingual intelligentsia, by mediating between vernacular and Latin, mediated between earth and heaven. This language of the sacred and profane is solidified in the way the Bible and Catechism were translated and made understandable to indigenous population. It helped to produce a space into a new imagination of community for indigenous population, one now formed by a European expression of Christianity. And from the latest book by Willie James Jennings, The Christian Imagination, he states, Latin was a discursive home for theology. The literary space he created was the most intensely autonomous, transcendent literary space in existence. So the first catechism prepared for Asia, especially those of the nobles, Xavier, Ricci, and the Rhodes, for example, of how the privilege of Latin was then translated to the local languages of the various countries these missionaries founded. There are differences between these catechisms, especially by the Rhodes, but there isn't a dialogue structure as found in Ricci, but rather it's expository. What is more interesting is that the superimposition of a literary space mirrors the reformation of actual space in the accumulation of land by the colonial powers. While the missionaries may not have consciously thought that their contribution to colonial power struggle, they contributed to a production of space that has lasting consequences. Latin, as a transcendent language, was introduced also the power languages of Europe were coupled with that. Thus, missionaries imposed two layers of power on the indigenous people. Here is the merging of a transcendent language with the powers of Europe, guaranteeing a powerful structure that intimidated the new colonies. Since the Europeans had both Latin and their own vernacular, they maneuvered easily between the sacred and the profane. The introduction of vernacular to the indigenous population provided an entrance into this new production of space. The missionaries still held power over the indigenous population that legitimized their sacred language and the profane vernacular. So the vernacular spaces that missionaries enjoyed were introduced in land, but also would stir desires of new population that they encountered. And I just want a final quote here. For Christianity and for Christian moderns, the rise of vernacular Christianity shadowed the rise of vernacular space. Vernacular space points to the transformation of indigenous place to commodity space, a space occupied by nationalistic consciousness, yet permeable and open to the constant reconfiguration of its identity. Unquote. And so, while the transcendent language of Latin kept Catholics focused on higher things, the introduction of the vernacular into a liturgy reformed the relationship in the spaces itself. So those are the spaces. The kind of religious plurality that exists in Asia is not a product of any recent demographic changes. It is unlike the way religious plurality has come about in some European nations and the United States to reach recent migration of people. It has existed for many centuries. The question of religious pluralism is not something new to Asian Christians. For their historical beginning, Asian Christians lived with religious plurality around them and had to encounter questions, theological and otherwise, with regard to their role and place within such religious pluralistic settings. Pluralism is not just among other religions, but also within Christianity itself. Here we've already identified that there are Christianities and there are Catholicities, so I won't go further into that. And then finally to my second point, dialogue in new spaces. The Federation of Asian Bishops' Conference advocates for dialogue. They explain dialogue as a witnessing to Christ in word and deed by reaching out to people in the concrete realities of their daily lives, in their particular cultural context, their own religious tradition, and their social, economic conditions. The FABC speaks about dialogue as a triple dialogue, which means engaging with the cultures of Asia, the poor, and other religions. The Church must see that it's an active dialogue with all three in order to be present and to be effective within Asia. One can see this triple dialogue as a system of flow between sacred and profane in a newly produced space. The faithful will not only embrace the faith better, but also witness to the rest of Asia now in a new space that melds together missionary contribution in the contemporary globalized world. Overall, there are some positive and some negative experience of interreligious dialogue, and I would like to highlight really some of the negative, and there are three. Or more, but three I would like to highlight. Few people participated in this society, so the dialogue, the interreligious dialogue. There was also a lack of follow-up after their encounters, where the bishops in 1970 really talked about dialogue. And it was only really among leaders and scholars that the concerns of the ordinary people seemed to fall off. There wasn't that concern. So these concerns to be addressed as the Catholic Church continues to be an important part of Asia. The FABC has repeatedly affirmed the necessity of this triple dialogue as a way of Asian churches to become truly Asian. In their 2000 meeting with the theme of the New Church in Asia, a mission of love and service, the FABC proposed 8 movements which constitute the beginning to Asian ecclesiology. I would just briefly highlight those 8. A movement toward the church of the poor, the church of the young, 1. 2. A movement toward a truly local church. 3. A movement toward deep interiority so that the church becomes a deeply praying community whose contemplation is inserted in the context of our time and the cultures of our people. 4. A movement toward the authentic community of faith. 5. A movement toward active integral evangelization toward a new sense of mission. 6. A movement toward empowerment of men and women. 7. A movement toward active involvement in generating and serving life. And 8. A movement toward this triple dialogue. These 8 steps will also produce a new space in which the Catholic Church will negotiate with the diversity of society of people who are already amenable to a different religion. So in conclusion, the production of space is ongoing, especially when cultures meet and religions rub shoulders with other traditions in new contexts. The strategies of the missionaries in bringing new Catholic language, objects, and buildings into Asia establish a whole new imagined community that on the one hand was accepted into the religious landscape of Asia, and on the other challenged the foreigners about their religious and cultural tradition. Catholicity shaped by the European churches now needed to be recast into the new spaces of Asia. Not only would Catholicity be reevaluated or judged by what it says, but also by what it does. That is, how it perceived the Asians and what it did to engage. The new spaces are now not only the issue of concern for the missionary, but fall into the responsibility of the local population that have now embraced this new religion. The negotiation of this new space will raise the issues of national loyalty, adherence to cultural traditions, and the purity of practice in the new religion. How that is played out or maintained in Asia is the ongoing question even today. Questions vary in different countries of Asia. The loyalty, the country, or to religion, are ones that surfaces in places such as China and Vietnam, where patriotism is highly prized. So the triple dialogue advocated for the FABC will provide a new space in which the Catholic Church can bring together a past that witnessed to a struggle for understanding and harmonize with the present that is working out the challenges of globalization.
So we have a bit of time for questions and comments, so the floor is open to you. Maybe just to start off, the concept of Milwaukee, as Teresia mentioned it in your discussion of the production of sacred space, seemed to bear a little congruence with one another. I wonder if you'd both like to comment on that.
Yeah, the search for an ecclesiology that is bubbling from below and among particularly the indigenous people, I thought it was a striking parallel there, particularly when you're talking about the permission to go vernacular, to use the vernacular language. And you are right in pointing out that the insistence on Latin as the sacred language and vernacular is part of the profane continues in a way to marginalize it. There's like a little bit of like, okay, here is a little piece of the liberation, but we are keeping most of it. So I see that struggle, particularly among the Dalit communities, would be really, they would resonate, or our people would resonate with some of what is going on. It's just the people down there trying to be judged in their own terms, rather than in terms dictated by the outside.
I guess I imagine the spaces to be very fluid. I didn't put I guess an image of an object, but I think there's such a fluidity to that. This whole imagining can't just be framed within these previous structures that try to frame it, that it has to be fluid. I do hear it, and that has to come from the grassroots level, from the people. But where, as I pointed out with the missionaries, it wasn't, the people weren't really pulled into the conversation. It was among the elite or the intelligentsia, where that conversation, as the FABC points out, that also needs to be highlighted now, even more so. So where the people, how are they speaking and what voices are being lent to them? It's the ongoing.
In fact, there is something similar. The whole idea of basic Christian community was actually mooted at the level of the hierarchy. Let them be small Christian communities. And at that level, you can say, oh, this is an allowance, that's a privilege that was given to them by the hierarchy. But what the communities have done with this, have attended the services. Many times the priest to people ratio is not at par, and so in some contexts people get to hear mass, so you are priest only once, maybe a month, and in the meantime they have to pay for themselves. And I have participated in communities like that where when the priest is in town, usually it's probably an Italian priest, is still speaking broken vernacular. It's a different kind of service. Everybody's kind of like, okay, should we clap now or should we not clap now? Should we stop? But when the priest is not there, it's themselves and the spontaneous prayer, raised hands and a little glossolalia on the side, nobody is listening. And it's a very different kind of the quality to it. And so it may be that the hierarchy is imagining the kind of a subcategory, let's allow them this, but spontaneously, this has the potential to grow into a real ecclesiology that speaks from the people's needs to the people's realities. And some communities have emerged spontaneously without, when they migrate to the Rift Valley, for example, the nearest church is 50 kilometers away, and they are used to mass every week in places near Nairobi. They just create their own space. They're doing the same in California. House church, let's meet for fellowship in somebody's house. If the priest is available, he'll come and find us, but life goes on.
Yes.
A little contribution. I think what Teresia said is very true. Africa is very diverse, and there are a lot of regional differences. You notice in Africa. Like the church in East Africa is very different from the church in West Africa. And if the church in Nigeria is different from the church in Ghana, the church in Africa. So you notice the kind of regional differences. And the work of missionaries to had impact, negative or positive, depending on who went there and the kind of interrelationship between the local people and particular missionary group that came. Like if you talk of Eastern Nigeria, where I come from, the work of the Spiritans, it was a very successful missionary enterprise. And they used the schools very well to evangelize. They laid the ground, for primary schools, secondary schools, colleges. In Eastern Nigeria, you have a very vibrant local church, arising from the work of the missionaries and the collaboration with the local population. And they also gave rise to rise of vocations. Seminaries were flourishing, the convents were blossoming, and you have a strong local clergy. And so in many localities, you have catechists who are trained by the missions who went to school. So lots of differences, are to be, seen according to the various parts of Africa where you go. And so things are not the same everywhere, And also the politics of the various countries also affect how the church, is developing and the kind of church, see here and there. So that's what you see. So never to generalize about Africa. There's a lot of regional differences. And I'm quite saying what she said about East Africa is very correct about that region. And also the challenge of Islam is another point.
Which you have plenty of in Nigeria, but it might not be as big an issue in Congo.
Where I was in Nigeria, the Christians came together to fight Islam. So they had a common foe, so to say, so they could leave some of the differences behind, and they had a common foe, which was Islam, or if it is some other political agent that they had to confront. So political, religious differences also lay the foundation for what kind of church community that could arise.
But still, that challenge for an ecclesiology of pluralism, whether we are talking about the pluralism across religions or pluralism across ethnic divisions, is a challenge, and that cuts across whichever context we are talking about. How do we handle difference? Whether religious, economic, gender is a big challenge.
Even the women have very strong, very vibrant women groups. But the church in Eastern Nigeria is run by women. It's very surprising, even though they don't have all the powers that are given. But without the women, the church will collapse. We have a very strong Christian curriculum.
How much of that though is rooted in some of the indigenous traditions of West Africa, particularly in terms of women's involvement in society? I'm thinking of the Igbo. I don't know whether you are Igbo, I don't know. But I have read the works by the Igbo women analysts and talking about how traditional Igbo society had these kind of possibilities for women, some of which possibilities have kind of been eroded.
Yes.
I think all churches would collapse in that way. They're not touching that.
Oh, yes.
That's true.
No, I just want to ask you just one question to both of you. To what degree is the church enculturated in these two different places? And what are the special points of tension in the process of indigenization?
Enculturation. I think at the level of maybe the material culture and the level of the heritage, there's a lot of, as I pointed out, the translation and the popularization of the heritage that any church you go to, whether it's Swahili, there's that sense of like, I'm in an African worship situation. Finding that even in diaspora, the dancing, the liturgical vestments. some scholars, people like John McKell and even Laurenti Magesa, are saying that inculturation has really not gone deep enough. There's a sense of like it's like we play the drum and we dance and we're good. But let's say that might be even leading us into the question of like exoticization. We are inculturated, we are playing the drum. Does inculturation, they say there's a room for inculturation to also kind of link up with the liberation project of Africa. And Makela talks, for example, about people like Nyamiti talk about translating the concepts, theological concepts, Christology, and so forth. But Makela talks about translation that goes deeper to ask larger questions. For example, when we insist on celebrating the Eucharist with wheat bread, like give the example of Makela, wheat bread and grape wine in a context where these don't grow, and in a context where real food is difficult to come by, what are we saying theologically and symbolically? And I'm not saying this is the only way to go, but that's one criticism or one concern that African theologians have raised about inculturation. Has it gone far enough? Is it encompassing? Does it? And women too have criticized the inculturation theology because of women's critique of culture and cultural sexism. So the possibility of quote-unquote romanticizing African cultures and therefore not asking hard questions of indigenous cultures as much as we ask of Christianized cultures, Europeanized cultures.
I would just give this example that at least in Vietnam, that the people are more attracted to, or they relate more with a Jesus that looks European, a Mary that looks European, and that the church is a Gothic cathedral. So that when they come to the United States, the people still are more attracted to a European-looking Mary, a European-looking, rather than an Asian-looking. So that they've been trained, so that this enculturation that is.
I would say it's a journey though. I mean, we are on the route, we are en route, we haven't reached. It's a destination, it's not a destination, it's a journey towards which we may go 3 steps forward and several steps back or sideways, depending on the